Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Thank you for joining me today on Blessed Man Meditations, where we look at Christian responses to alternative worldviews. On this channel, lately, we have been going through Paul Copan's work as God a Moral Monster, where we make sense of the Old Testament God, where Copan looks at multiple Old Testament passages that critics of the Bible, critics of Christianity, have levied against the historic Christian faith, and they have made accusations about the God of the Bible. And Copan has answered those objections in this book. And here is the cover of that book, Is God a Moral Monster? These are the contents of the book. Today we are wrapping up our study of the book. And Paul Copan is a professor in Palm Beach, Atlantic University in Florida, and he lives in Florida and has written a bunch on apologetics and philosophy. So today we're looking at chapter 20 of Is God a Moral Monster? And where we ask the question, we have moved beyond this God, haven't we? Where we look at Jesus as the fulfiller of the Old Testament. The skeptic will ask, we have evolved in society as a people such that we don't need this God anymore. The Christian knows better than that. But today we're going to look at Jesus as the fulfiller of the Old Testament, beginning with the gifts of the Jews. On February 16th, in the year 1809, John Adams wrote a letter to F.A. Vanderkamp, in which Adams insisted that the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation. Not only did the Hebrews' laws help bring a civilizing influence to the nations, but they preserved and propagated to humankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which Adams believed to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. So John Adams believed that morality should have its foundation in the God of Scripture. In his fascinating book, The Gift of the Jews, Thomas Cahill reinforces this argument. This ancient nomadic desert tribe helped introduce to humanity a sense of history, a past, a present, and a future, and the idea that history is going somewhere, that it has a point. History has a point. And for the Christian, that point is the fulfillment of all things by Christ. It is first coming, and then those things that will be fulfilled at his second coming. For the Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and other ancient peoples, time was cyclical. Things were always as they have always been. Same old, same old. We could say the same about many Eastern philosophies and religions today. They espouse a doctrine of karma with its reincarnation cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. What's more, the Old Testament reveals a God who has a global cosmic plan and who involves humans as history-shaping participants in that plan. Yes, humans matter. Those created in God's image do matter, and they are all important to him, no matter where they're from or who they are or what they've done. The Old Testament's genealogies reflect the important role that humans play in the unfolding of God's purposes. On top of this, the Jews introduced a robust monotheism. Rather than being just one God in the pantheon of others or just a regional deity, Yahweh was and is the only deity who matters. He still is. The Christian worships the God of the Bible, same God of the Old Testament as the New Testament. There is no God of the Old Testament and God of the New Testament. There is one Lord, one faith, and one baptism. The Lord our God is one. Indeed, he's the only one who exists, Copan says. And along with this, the Jews introduced a new way to experience reality. And this sense of reality is that there's a divine being who regularly, personally engages humans, whose choices really make a difference. God uses human choices to bring about his purposes. Human decision-making has great significance, and God interweaves human choices into his overarching plans. He works all things together for good to accomplish his purposes and the purposes that he has ordained for his people. We are not the pawns of fate or at the mercy of the whims of the gods. On the other hand, humans aren't so powerful that they can manipulate God to do their bidding. Humans cannot manipulate God to do their bidding. They ultimately will bow the knee to the Lord Jesus Christ. Either they will submit to him in this life as Lord, or they will submit to him in the next life as judge. These themes are some of the gifts of the Jews to the rest of the world. Let's look at the gifts of Christians. Horrendous, anti-Christian actions have been carried out in the name of Christ. For instance, the Crusades, the Inquisition, witch hunting, or fighting between Catholics and Protestants in Europe could be named as these horrendous anti-Christian actions that have been carried out in the name of Christ. Not that Jesus wants to be identified with this kind of religious zealotry. Many things can be done in God's name that cause it to be blasphemed among the Gentiles, like Paul said to the Romans in Romans chapter 2, verse 24. The problem with Christopher Hitchens' claim that religion poisons everything is that it's both vague and extreme. The term religion in the existing literature is notoriously vague and difficult to define. And if Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens suggest that Stalin somehow was religious, then at this point we throw up our hands in bewilderment. Hitchens' statement about religion's noxious influence is also extreme in its lopsidedness. Does religion poison everything and bring no benefits whatsoever? More thoughtful, sophisticated atheists would strongly disagree. An atheist philosopher named Walter Sinnot-Armstrong responds, this religion poisons everything slogan. He calls it inaccurate and insulting. Armstrong advises atheists not to cheer on or laugh at Hitchens' jokes, nor should they remain silent. To Sinnot-Armstrong, Hitchens' critique of religion is like a senile relative who's constantly making bizarre statements. His assessment is neither fair nor very illuminating. It's as I've said many times through these different videos on this book, many people like Christopher Hitchens will build up straw men and attack a straw man. They will make a caricature of biblical Christianity and attack that as though they are winning the debate. And it's really sad. And unfortunately, many Christians they either don't care enough to set the record straight, or they don't know how to set the record straight. And I certainly don't have all the answers myself. Ironically, the new atheist mortal grenades lobbed against the Christian faith in the name of morality are actually historically founded upon the very faith they criticize. Historians have documented that the values of human rights, tolerance, social injustice, and racial reconciliation are the legacy of the Christian faith, not some secular Enlightenment ideals. The things that our secular society champions, human rights, tolerance, social injustice, and racial reconciliation, these things wouldn't be the positive influences they are if it were not for the Christian faith, Copan asserts. For all her flaws, the Christian church has played an important role in bringing huge benefits to civilization. This impact has often been inspired by devotion to Christ, which overflows into love for one's neighbor to the glory of God. These documented achievements include the following. The achievements that the New Testament church, the biblical church, has, the benefits, the achievements that the church has brought about in society include eradicating slavery. Man, we spent a lot of time going through this book about the problems that the new atheists levied against the Christians with their views on the slavery and as it's described in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And here we see that it was the Christians who actually eradicated slavery. As the Christian faith spread into barbarian Europe after the fall of Rome, the practice of slavery dwindled Slavery virtually died out in Europe by the Middle Ages when Europe was well Christianized. The Christian influence helped bring an end to slavery. When slavery reappeared, it was strongly opposed by dedicated believers among the Mennonites and Quakers, as well as by Christian leaders such as theologian Richard Baxter, John Wesley, and William Wilberforce. Christians opposed infanticide and rescuing infants from exposure. In fact, the Christians are the loudest voices opposed to abortion in my country, America. This practice, common among Greeks and Romans, was outlawed in the 4th century under Christian influence. Illuminating the gladiatorial games. These brutal games usually involved slaves and criminals. They were outlawed in the late 4th century in the East and the early 5th century in the West, building hospitals and hospices. Personally, I just went through a hospice experience with my own mother. And if it wasn't for the Christian faith, I guess we wouldn't have had the benefit of hospice. My mother-in-law also went through hospice care. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, early Christians were concerned about health care and looking after the sick and dying, and thank God for that. Because as I said, my family personally has benefited from the care that hospice has brought. Once the Christian faith became official in the empire, the ministry expanded. This ministry expanded considerably, hospitals and hospices. The Council of Nicaea in AD 325 commissioned bishops to establish hospice care in every city where a church building existed. Would you look at that? In AD 325, hospice care was instituted where there was a church. The first hospital was built under St. Basil in Caesarea in 369 AD. By the Middle Ages, hospitals existed throughout Europe. Think to Florence Nightingale, the founding of the Red Cross, and so on. These documented achievements include the following: elevating women's status and rights. Well, that's interesting. We discussed, as we went through this book, how the new atheist makes claims that the God of the Bible is into making women suffer, is into making women oppressed. And we see that it's the Christian faith that helped elevate women's status and rights to the opposite of what the feminists would claim. Feminists claim the Christian faith puts women down and keeps them under. History shows the opposite. The women have been routinely oppressed in most cultures. We see something different in Jesus' treatment of women. For instance, in John chapter 4, the Samaritan was not supposed to have dealings with the Jews, but Jesus sought the Samaritan woman out. Mary and Martha. Jesus' treatment of Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10. Luke's gospel highlights the prominent place of women in Jesus' life and ministry. Early Christians routinely protected women and children from neglect and abuse. So women were not being oppressed as a result of Christianity. As a result of Christianity, women were being protected and elevated. But when undiscerning people are presented with these accusations that are based on incomplete data that the new atheists bring, people can be dissuaded into believing all sorts of lies and seeing Christians get misrepresented and blackballed, and it's so sad. So another gift of Christians is founding Europe's and North America's great universities. The Sorbonne, Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton are some of the many notable universities established to God's glory. In Europe, many universities sprang forth from medieval monasteries. In America, the earliest and most notable universities began as institutions for training pastors and missionaries, writing extraordinary works of literature. These were achievements of Christians. The remarkable literature of Christians inspired by their faith ranges from Augustine's City of God to Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History to Dante's Comedy and John Milton's Paradise Lost to the works of J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Flannery O'Connor and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Engaging in writing about philosophy and theology and the life of reason, some of the leading representatives include Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, Blaise Pascal, Pascal's Wager, Soren Kierkegaard, and Jonathan Edwards. Today, organizations such as the Society of Christian Philosophers and the Evangelical Philosophical Society attest to this ongoing tradition. Christians have created beautiful pieces of art, sculpture, and architecture, or 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 the art has had a Christian influence. Maybe the artists themselves weren't themselves Christians, but their work was definitely influenced by Christianity. Think of Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Van Ryn, Peter Paul Rubens, or Byzantine and Gothic cathedrals. One book I'd like to go through on this channel is J. Warner Wallace, Person of Interest, and that statement about how Christ has influenced art, and and writing and philosophy and literature. Those sound like the kinds of things that would be included in the work by J. Warner Wallace, Person of Interest. I have not yet gotten that book, but I would like to one day, Lord willing. And more gifts of the Christians, establishing modern science. Boy, the evolutionist hates to hear this, that modern science had its roots in the biblical conviction that the world was created by a rational God. The theistic universe in which we live is the reason why science is possible. You hear Christians say that, like I believe Frank Turek has said things like that. For this reason, it was orderly and predictable, and it could be studied and understood by human minds. We could mention Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Michael Faraday, William T. Kelvin, Robert Boyle, Anton Lavoisier, and many others who had an impact in what became modern science and the biblical conviction that undergirded it. Brilliant music was composed by people with Christian influence, such as Johann Sebastian Bach, George F. Handel. I wonder, I'm assuming that's the man after whom Handel's Messiah is named. Felix Mendelssohn, Franz Joseph Haydn speak for themselves. Advocating human rights, democracy, political freedoms, concern for the poor. These themes are rooted in the biblical ideals that all humans are made in God's image, that they have dignity and worth, and they're equal before the law. It's difficult to exaggerate the impact of Jesus of Nazareth had on history and the countless lives impacted by this man's life and teaching. Indeed, the transforming power of Jesus' cross and his resurrection. The historian Yaroslav Pelikan remarked that by the changing of the calendar to BC and AD according to the year of our Lord and other ways, everyone is compelled to acknowledge that because of Jesus of Nazareth, history will never be the same. And this sounds again like something that J. Warner Wallace would refer to in Person of Interest. Dawkins is quite wrong. Richard Dawkins is quite wrong in asserting that the Christian faith, like Islam, was spread by the sword. If Dawkins and others who think like Dawkins took an honest look at Christian history, he and they would have to acknowledge that the earliest Christian movement was one of the politically and socially disempowered. This movement was first called the Way, as noted in those passages in the book of Acts. It was called the Way because Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life in John 14:6, and it often gathered to itself slaves and members of the lower classes. Would you look at that? The groups that the new atheists would claim that the believers in God oppressed the slaves and the members of the lower class. Biblical Christianity actually gathered to themselves the slaves. In the first 3 centuries, the church grew by deeds of love and mercy and the proclamation of the good news of Jesus. Holy wars had no place in this nonviolent movement. Rodney Stark, the respected 800-pound gorilla among sociologists, shows in his book The Victory of Reason how the success of the West, including the rise of science, rested entirely on religious foundations, and the people who brought it about were devout Christians. Would you look at that? Science wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the introduction that it was given by the devout Christians. But don't just take a Christian sociologist's word for it, Rodney Stark. Jürgen Habermas, one of Europe's most prominent philosophers today. Another fact about Habermas: he is a dyed-in-the-wool atheist. So Habermas, an atheist, highlights the inescapable historical fact that the biblical faith was the profound influence in shaping civilization. Even the atheists admit it. The ones who know their history admit it. Consider carefully the assessment of the atheist Habermas. Christianity, Habermas the atheist says, has functioned for the normative self-understanding of modernity as more than just a precursor or a catalyst. Egalitarian universalism, from which sprang the ideas of freedom and social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy, is the direct heir to the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. So egalitarianism, the egalitarian universalism, which undergirded freedom and social solidarity, and morality of conscience and human rights, and democracy. The things, human rights and democracy, two things that we champion in 21st century America. This atheist said that those ideas would not be the focal points of society that they are today if it were not for the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. And do you see the insanity of the liberal who wants to remove references to God from schools and remove prayer from schools and silence the voice of Christian reason in society? He wouldn't enjoy the freedoms that he enjoys or she enjoys if it wasn't for the society that was birthed on the Judeo-Christian foundation. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there's no alternative to it. And in light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. Finally, end quote from Jürgen Habermas, the atheist. In the words of human rights scholar Max Stackhouse, end quote, begin quote, intellectual honesty demands recognition of the fact that what passes as secular Western principles of basic human rights develop nowhere else than out of key strands of the biblically rooted religion. Western principles of basic human rights wouldn't be what they are if it wasn't for biblically rooted religion. So if this God is such a moral monster, as the new atheists claim, then why does our largely secular society still yearn for human rights based on biblically rooted religion that they don't even realize is based on biblically rooted religion? Because if they did realize that, they would not be yearning for the rights the way that they do. So consider 3 fundamental historical facts. The first historical fact: talk of natural rights emerged in the Catholic theology of the Middle Ages as a language which itself was built on the biblical understanding of the image of God in all humans. Fundamental historical fact number 2. The chief movers who established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which speaks of humans being endowed with reason and conscience, were primarily church coalitions and individual Christian leaders who worked closely with some Jewish rabbis to create a new world order of human rights. This fundamental historical fact number 3. Even the allegedly secular Enlightenment's universal human rights emphasis has deep theological roots. This is quite obvious in the two leading documents of the 18th century. The Declaration of Independence, which speaks of human beings being endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, affirming human rights in the presence and under the auspices of God, the Supreme Being. In short, the Judeo-Christian imprint on human rights in the present is vital for correcting much secularist religion bashing. Even non-Westerners have come to recognize the remarkable impact of the Christian faith in the West. Time magazine's well-respected correspondent David Aiken reported the summary of one Chinese scholar's lecture to a group of 18 American tourists. The correspondent David Aiken says, quote, I guess this is the summary of the lecture. One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West over all the world, Aiken said. We studied everything we could from historical, political, economic, cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we've realized that the heart of your culture is your religion. So, this Chinese scholar realized the heart of American culture is the religion, Christianity. That's why the West has been so powerful, because of Christianity. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life has been what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. The Chinese scholar said, we don't have any doubt about this. The Chinese scholar didn't have any doubt that the Christian foundation, that the Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. The things that made America great had their foundation in biblical Christianity. That's what the Chinese scholar concluded. This lecturer was not some Chinese lecturer was not some ill-informed crackpot. To the contrary, this Chinese lecturer represented one of China's premier academic research organizations, that organization being the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We don't just find Western scholarly support for the Jewish Christian worldview. We find it in the East as well. Let's look at Jesus as the climax. The scriptures begin with the creational affirmation that all humans are made in God's image. In many ways, the improvements of the Old Testament over a good deal of other ancient Near Eastern legislation were a significant move toward that ideal. The Old Testament provides us with enduring perspectives about human dignity and fallenness, not to mention moral insights regarding justice, faithfulness, mercy, generosity, and the like. However, if we stop with the Old Testament, we won't see the entire storyline as it's brought to completion in Jesus. The Old Testament was in many ways anticipatory of something far greater. So if Jesus truly brought a new covenant for the true Israel and has begun to renew the creation as the second Adam, then we ought to concern ourselves with how his incarnation, ministry, atoning death, and resurrection shed light backward on the Old Testament with all its messiness. And we looked at that messiness as we've gone through this book, and we've seen how Jesus shows us the better way. To stop with the Old Testament texts without allowing Christ, the second Adam, and the new true Israel to illuminate them, our reading and interpretation of the Old Testament will be greatly impoverished and in certain ways misrepresented, just like the new atheists do. They misrepresent God by stopping with the Old Testament. One day we'll fully enjoy the realization of pristine goodness and shalom. In the new heaven and earth, no social or racial discrimination will exist. Swords will be beaten into plowshares. Peace will reign. In his own day, Jesus reaffirmed Old Testament texts about loving God and neighbor and called Israel back to live by God's creational designs. That was then, but hardened hearts are still with us today. Yet Jesus' approach to the Old Testament should instruct Christians living in the already, not yet. That's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves as already Christian, but not yet perfected. We find this world as already being changed by the gospel, but not yet fully changed because Christ is not reigning on earth as yet. We're living with many benefits of the cross already, but we still live in a fallen world as we await the new heaven and new earth and the receiving of our resurrection bodies, which is not yet. Though the new atheists don't intend it, and though they often go about it in wrong-headed ways, they can serve as a proper challenge for us Christians. How? How can the new atheist serve as a proper challenge for Christians? The new atheist can remind Christians to be more thoughtful in our faith, to live kingdom-centered lives with great Christian passion and consistency, to deepen our commitment to justice and opposing oppression, to think through contemporary obstacles to belief, and to offer a more compelling vision in word and deed to a watching world. And hopefully, Copan, definitely Copan did that in this book, and hopefully those who have listened to these videos that I've created based off of Copan's book, hopefully some of this may have caused a skeptic listening to this to re-examine their position. We all need to take a fresh look at Jesus and let our gaze at him shape our devotion to him, our love for others, even our enemies, and our love for the culture and world in which we find ourselves. Author and pastor Tim Keller gives us a start for our reflection. Tim Keller says, quote, "If your fundamental is a man dying on the cross for his enemies, if the very heart of your self-image and your religion is a man praying for his enemies as he died for them, sacrificing for them, loving them, if that sinks into your heart of hearts, it's going to produce the kind of life that the early Christians produced, the most inclusive possible life out of the most exclusive possible claim. And that is that this is the truth." But what is the truth? What is the truth? The truth is that God became weak, loving, and dying for the people who for the people who opposed him, dying, forgiving them. God became weak, loving, and dying for the people who opposed him, and this God, dying for them, forgave them. While we may stumble or be troubled when reading certain Old Testament texts, we can put them in proper perspective by looking in the right places. The ultimate resolution is found in God's clarifying word to us, and the one who became flesh and lived among us, who died and rose again on our behalf. The God whom the new atheists consider a monster is not just a holy God to be reckoned with, but also a loving, self-sacrificing God who invites us to be reconciled to him. I don't want to talk about that part. And that is the end of Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Thank you so much for tuning into this. If you know somebody, if you're a Christian and you know somebody who is not a Christian and identifies as an atheist, and their primary reason for doing so has to do with these Old Testament passages, please share with them this book, share with them these videos that I've made based on this book. I don't benefit from I purchased this book with my own money. I don't know Paul Copan. I've never spoken with him. I've never met him. I have no benefit from doing this. I just want to get the truth out and see people who don't know the Lord come to know the Lord in a saving way. That's my goal. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.